Hello, my name is Don Hall, and I'm grateful to the Boulder Bookstore for inviting me to record this author Q&A about the Regeneration Handbook, Transform Yourself to Transform the World. It's basically about a different kind of activism than the one most people are familiar with. While demonstrations, direct actions, boycotts, and other forms of political organizing are clearly needed to make our voices heard to people in positions of power and push for better policies, they aren't sufficient in themselves to bring about the radical, holistic changes that are currently needed. For the first time in human history, we've outstripped our planet's abundant regenerative capacities and need to find an entirely new way to live in harmony with the Earth that works for at least 8 billion people. In this context, it's essential that we not only reform current systems, but also cultivate systemic alternatives to the status quo that are truly sustainable and just. Although this might seem impossible, the good news is that it's already happening in thousands of communities all over the world, and there are many different ways to get involved. I first got involved in what I've come to call conventional political activism when I was in college more than 20 years ago. I started working with the Students for a Free Tibet before getting more deeply involved in the anti-war and anti-globalization movements at that time. Eventually, I began to focus more and more on climate change, but felt increasingly out of alignment with the conventional political approach to change-making. Fortunately, when I was a graduate student at Naropa University, I stumbled across an entirely different way in the form of permaculture, intentional communities, and the international transition towns movement. It started in 2005 in a small progressive town in southwest England. One of its founders, Rob Hopkins, was a permaculture teacher and had the idea to apply permaculture principles and solutions to try to transition his local community off of fossil fuels. Permaculture, for those who don't know, is a term that was coined by a couple of Australian ecologists in the 1970s. It initially referred to a permanent agriculture, but has gradually broadened out to encompass all aspects of creating a permanent culture. In just its first few years, Transition Town Totnes planted dozens of fruit and nut trees, produced a local food directory, started a community-owned energy company, consulted with local businesses to help reduce their carbon footprints, hosted countless educational events, community discussions, and reskilling workshops, and even launched a local complementary currency called the Totnes Pound. Based on those early successes, Hopkins wrote the Transition Handbook in 2008, which became an international bestseller and spread the movement around the world. Currently, there are over 1,000 transition initiatives in more than 50 countries. Each group is autonomous, focusing on whatever their local community needs most, but they're all bound together by a common worldview, a shared set of principles, and an organizing model that's highly collaborative, action-oriented, and holistic. Over the past 15 years, I've served in a variety of different roles throughout the transition movement, and it continues to be one of my greatest sources of hope for the future. Most of the research I did for this book took place before I even sat down to write it. Every one of the more than 60 sources I cite in my bibliography, which address subjects as diverse as ecology, cosmology, psychology, sociology, and organizational development, I've personally found useful in my own change-making journey. There's so many different things that we all can do that I hesitate to pick just one. I believe, as one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentors, Howard Thurman famously said, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. However, if that approach doesn't work for you, I might suggest trying to grow at least some of your own food. Gardening is a profoundly revolutionary act that has many benefits. It connects us with the natural world, builds community among neighbors, makes us less dependent on the industrial growth society, promotes health and well-being, saves us money, and teaches us valuable skills. I have to admit that I haven't been reading a lot of books lately. I go through phases, but right now I'm mostly reading news articles and blogs. Nevertheless, one of my recent favorites was Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. She's one of my very favorite writers because her books are incredibly thought-provoking and extremely accessible, which is a rare mix. She also seems to put out a book about once every 10 years that captures the zeitgeist of that decade. In the 1990s, it was No Logo. In the 2000s, it was The Shock Doctrine. In the 2010s, it was This Changes Everything. And Doppelganger seems to be that book for our surrealistic 2020s. It's really good. I started with about 1,000 pages of material and whittled it down to just over 200 pages in an effort to make the most valuable insights, stories, tools, practices, and resources I gathered over the past 2 decades as easy as possible for both experienced and aspiring change makers to access. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that I have a new website, evolutionarychange.org, where you can find more information about the book, read related blog posts, and check out upcoming events. I'd be happy to. I don't know if you'll consider this short, but I'd like to read the opening section from the final chapter of my book. It begins with one of my all-time favorite quotes from Margaret Wheatley's 2017 book, Who Do We Choose to Be? Meg says, I know it is possible for leaders to use their power and influence, their insight and compassion, to lead people back to an understanding of who we are as human beings, to create the conditions for our basic human qualities of generosity, contribution, community, and love, to be evoked no matter what. I know it is possible to create islands of sanity in the midst of wildly disruptive seas. And I have studied enough history to know that such leaders always arise when they're needed most. So it continues. If we're going to do what it actually takes to save the world, we need an unshakable conviction that it's worth saving. I occasionally hear from people, including some who are generally well-meaning and intelligent, that nothing we do could possibly matter in the grand scheme of things. So why bother? Everything ends, all species eventually die, and Earth would probably be better off without us. I suspect a lot of us secretly hold these kinds of beliefs to some extent. Well, understandable, this logic is based on several fundamental misperceptions about the nature of reality. Life is not purely chaotic and meaningless, nor is humanity beyond redemption. In fact, there's ample evidence to suggest that we are miraculous beings on an extraordinary planet in the midst of a vast sacred universe. Though detachment promises transcendent peace, it never delivers. Deep down, we know everything is interconnected, and ultimately, we can't fool ourselves. In his 2011 documentary, Journey of the Universe, evolutionary cosmologist Brian Swim explains that if the rate of our universe's expansion was just 1/1,000,000th of 1% faster, it would have flung its primordial matter so far apart that galaxies and planets wouldn't even have formed. Similarly, if our universe had expanded even 1/1,000,000th of 1% more slowly, everything would have collapsed into a black hole, ending the potential for life as we know it. Swim sums up the meaning of this by saying, what we've discovered is that we're living in a universe that is expanding at exactly the rate necessary for life and structures to come forth. It could be then that even though we can't call the early universe alive, we can understand it as life generating. NASA scientist James Lovelock expressed a similar idea in his 1979 book, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth. Although his Gaia hypothesis, which describes our planet as a self-regulating superorganism, was initially ridiculed, it has become increasingly accepted by the scientific community. Key evidence supporting it includes the consistency of global temperature, atmospheric composition, and ocean salinity throughout Earth's history. Since life began, global temperature has remained remarkably constant, even though the amount of heat radiating from the sun has increased by about 25%. And despite salt being washed continually from land into the oceans, salinity has hovered at around 4% for billions of years. This is partly thanks to tiny creatures called coccolithophores that capture excess salt in their shells and deposit it into the ocean floor when they die. Although it boggles the mind to try to understand how trillions of individual organisms could cooperate to achieve such a mutually beneficial state. Our own bodies are made up of trillions of individual cells that work together every minute of every day to maintain an optimal balance. While we may never fully comprehend how life works, it undeniably does. It intrinsically knows how to enable more and more life to thrive, and human beings have this same regenerative potential. Technology continues to progress. We're still far from being able to create anything as complex, intelligent, and beautiful as an earthworm, let alone a tree, a butterfly, or a human being. Standing on the leading edge of 14 billion years of cosmic evolution and 3.5 billion years of the evolution of life here on Earth. If we pause for even a moment to consider how much struggle and sacrifice it took for our ancestors to get us here, it's impossible to believe that throwing all of it away is no big deal. While we might envision a sci-fi future where we leave a ruined Earth behind to hop around from one galaxy to the next, we should check the math on this. The closest potentially habitable planet to Earth is currently thought to be Proxima Centauri b. Even at the fastest speed ever recorded for manned spacecraft, it would take a person nearly 114,000 years to get there. For practical purposes, we should consider ourselves here for the duration. Earth really is our only home. There's no planet B. The good news is that Earth will likely survive whatever we throw at it. And it's highly unlikely that humanity will go extinct in the near future. What's much more likely if we fail to act is that billions will suffer and die, and the range of possibilities available to subsequent generations will be greatly diminished. This is why we must rise to the challenges of our times. We can't simply tune out the world, telling ourselves that somebody else will handle it. If we excuse ourselves from taking action because others aren't acting either, nobody will step up, and our world will gradually become more and more dangerous. However, if we can find the courage to lean into this great transition, our bravery will inspire others to do the same. We might even consider that the journey humanity has been on for the past 10,000 years has been a necessary stage in our evolution. We could imagine our species as an unruly teenager who's rebelled against its parents to test boundaries, differentiate itself, and figure out who it really is. Now, having run up against global limits for the first time, we might finally be ready to enter into species adulthood with its many responsibilities, but also its wisdom, dignity, and power. In this way, the great unraveling could serve as an initiatory ordeal for the human species. In many traditional societies, rites of passage mark the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Sometimes these trials are extremely intense and not everybody makes it back alive. As frightening as this is, it seems to me a more helpful way to look at our current predicament than as some kind of cosmic mistake or proof that humanity is fatally flawed. Although we can and should condemn the many atrocities that have transpired during this time, it's also essential that we appreciate the many advances modern civilization has brought about. From the ability to connect with people all over the world and access vast stores of information with just the push of a button, to increase life expectancy and material comfort. We should work to preserve these things as much as possible, even as we seek to abandon the more harmful trappings of modernity. We need to combine the best of the past with the best of the present to bring about a regenerative future. 8 billion people simply cannot return to being hunter-gatherers. For the first time ever, humanity is faced with having to consciously create a just and sustainable culture. However, this unique challenge also presents a unique opportunity for us to awaken and fulfill our unfulfilled potential. I would even go so far as to say that I believe we can't truly be happy or whole at this time in history unless we are involved somehow in helping to heal our world. Take a moment to envision what humanity might achieve in the future if we're able to cross this evolutionary threshold. Our sun isn't expected to boil Earth's seas for another 1 to 2 billion years. How might we continue to evolve if we can find a way now to live in harmony with nature? It's possible that this existential crisis could draw out of us qualities that we've never imagined. As Swim poetically observes, the planet Earth was once molten rock and now sings operas. This is what I come back to when all other hope is lost. An appreciation of the sacredness of existence, and my responsibility to uphold and embody it the best I can. It's in our DNA, embedded in the fundamental patterns of our universe. Like it or not, we are all protagonists in a story that will be remembered for generations to come. What do we want those who come after us to say about us? Perhaps sitting around the fire in the ruins of the post-industrial age, that we sat by and watched the great unraveling unfold on the evening news, or that we did everything we possibly could just as soon as we knew.